going to wait here for people to get online for a second. I'm still learning how to make this happen. I think I am going to do videos where I do just record them on my own and upload them, things like book reviews and stuff. But other times, if there's just like a topic I want to talk about, I think that it makes sense to do them live. It's just a little bit more interactive. That can be distracting also, but I think it's a good way to do it. I can always just ignore what people say and upload whatever I want. So today I want to talk about something that obviously I've talked about it before. It's not going to be too radically different, but let me just change the name here. Let's see. Here we go. No image. Huh. Edit. Let's see just one. Okay, so the image should be up. And one person saying there's no image, and another person says that they do have an image. So, hey Ron Ronizetti, good to see you. Can you see me, or is there no image for you? Okay, excellent. So I'm going to assume that it's working. If some people can see me, if some people can't, then that's probably an indicator that there's something wrong on their end. So, yeah, so today I just wanted to kind of combine a couple topics here. Um, I was thinking about one of the problems that it just kind of philosophically here. You know, when you talk about crimes and victims, you usually have a very definite victim and somebody who you can pay restitution to. You know, so if you rob me, you can pay me restitution. If you harm me, you can pay me restitution. Even in cases where you destroy your victim, say you commit a murder, um, then their heirs or their family or anybody else who has any kind of relation to them can demand restitution. Um, and I'm talking about this in the sense of like in a free market anarcho-capitalist system. Um, there does a problem arise though if there really isn't anyone to claim. So let's say in the case of abortion, um, the two parents decide they want to abort their child, so they kill their child, and obviously the child can't file a lawsuit. The child um, will not have an advocate. The most obvious advocate would be the family, and the family are the ones who are guilty. Now, there might be cases of disputes where maybe the grandparents or aunts and uncles or siblings or some other organization that's near to it that might raise something on its behalf. Now, practically speaking, the ability for the parents to get away with a crime like that is quite high, no matter how illegal it is. But it does raise kind of a question of is it a crime if there is no way to do restitution? If there's no plaintiff, the victim has been destroyed, so is there a victim at that point? Or another way to look at it, um, and part of it's just practical, like we're going to have crimes that are committed that people get away with. You know, the perfect murder, which is a lot. Most murders don't go to trial and don't get a conviction. So a lot of people commit murder and essentially get away with it to one degree or another. And you know, you can ask, is that really a crime in that case? And I think people would say that it is. But kind of another interesting case is uh, the case of like something like circumcision, because in that case, you're taking somebody and you're removing their foreskin when they're an infant, and they grow up and there may have been traumas at the time, it may have hurt at the time, they may have screamed, there may be issues associated with that which are worth thinking about. But when they grow up, they're not going to remember having a foreskin. They're not going to have any firsthand value of a foreskin. Um, so they're probably not going to miss it. And that's what we see. We see most men who are cut don't miss their foreskins. Now, most of them are blissfully ignorant. They never really think about it. They are in many cases completely unaware that there's even anything missing. And if they do know something's missing, they just have no idea what, and there's no value that they can place on it. So the very large majority, and I'd say it must be pushing 99%, maybe less. It's certainly over 90. Um, they are blissfully ignorant of anything being taken, and they feel fine. And so does that then retroactively make it not a crime, um, or does it just make it not a crime? Period. Um, another and I think that there's an argument to be made that maybe it's not because they don't feel like anything's wrong. They don't go. They may not want to sue their parents. Now, there's a minority that do. There's a certain number of men who later come to really regret it and say that it's a problem. And there's also kind of, yes, I know you are, Ron. So am I. And but it does raise the question of uh, if is it a crime if somebody grows up and they say that they feel fine. Whenever you get in these debates, there's always going to be a legion of guys who are cut who say, quote, I feel fine, or something along those lines, and so I don't feel that I was victimized. And so does that then mean that they weren't? And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a lawyer last night, and we were talking about fiduciary responsibilities. And there's a concept of when you have a person who a human life that you are in control of legally for whatever reason. They're incapacitated, they're very young, that you have a lot of decision-making power, and you can decide to do things for that person. So, not uncommon case is children having the power of attorney over their aged parents, and maybe their parents are on some kind of life support or need a medical treatment, and sometimes the children can decide to take them off life support. And this happened to my grandma. She lived to be 80, 83, 84. She got very sick. It wasn't a sudden thing. She just gradually declined. She gave power of attorney to her oldest child, who then consulted with his siblings, and I think that they correctly decided that it didn't make sense to keep. Basically, they could keep her alive by giving her blood transfusions over and over and over again, but it would have a temporary effect. There was no chance of it actually like curing her of what was wrong, and that it would just you could give it to her every week and keep her coming every week, but she just lived in this horrible limbo. And so they just said stop giving her treatment, and she died within a week, I think. And so there's a very wide scope that they can make, but there's also an understanding that those powers are not unlimited. You can't make you are obligated. You have a duty in that case, a responsibility to do what that person would most likely want to have done. So, say you have a person who dies and they're intestate. You have the power of attorney, and you are dispensing with their estate. Assuming that there's assets to be dispensed. Um, you know, and let's say that they had 4 kids and they loved all their kids equally, but you have the power of attorney as the oldest child, and you just decide, well, they're going to give. Well, I'm going to say that everything goes to me and nothing goes to my 4 children, or my 3 siblings, um, or some other, my favorite golf club or whatever. Um, you know, there's an argument there that that's an abuse of their fiduciary responsibilities. That you can't just do whatever you want. You have to do what would be in the best interest of the person who you're responsible for. And in the case of something like circumcision, this becomes an interesting question. Because again, if you commit the circumcision, there's a good chance that they're going to grow up and feel fine with it. Um, in fact, some of them might become radical defenders of it, and there's psychological reasons why that could be. I mean, the reason circumcision is so popular as a ritual, not for infants, but for adolescents, is because it physically alters in a very visual way a very important part of the physiology of a man, and it's very public, and it is a powerful social signal for that reason. Um, and if you are born that way, some people are truly apathetic. They really don't care, and they would be like, well, whatever, I was or I wasn't, I don't really care. But many people will grow up and even defend it. So, uh, then that becomes a question: is that a choice that a parent can make? Again, even though parents have, and generally speaking, parents have much broader powers than simply power of attorney. But there are limits. So a parent can't decide that they want to get tattoos on their child. Parents can't decide to kill their child once it's born. They can before, and that's another interesting, discussion to have. Um, they do one second. Um, so the question becomes, what should they decide? Do they have the right to do circumcision? Now, what's interesting here is that in general, in the West, in the United States, and basically throughout the West, they can do things that are medically necessary. Oh, you need to have an operation, you have a tumor, you need to get a vaccination, you need to get a shot, you need whatever. They can agree to do that. Cosmetic surgeries, though, are different things. For one thing, tattooing is illegal. So you have this strange um, fact that parents could not legally tattoo their son's foreskin, but they could cut it off, and that would be fine. But it's interesting legally. The argument here is you can't do things you can't do surgical alterations for cultural or religious reasons. So if you come and say, oh, well, it's our religion that our daughters be circumcised, for instance, to pick a completely random example, you can't just do that. And the argument is, well, because female circumcision, whatever its ritual or religious significance that might sincerely be had, isn't medically beneficial and indeed could be considered harmful. Um, and so the same would be true with like foot binding, forehead crushing or shaping, neck elongation, disking. Piercing is controversial. I think it is technically legal in most places, but the placing of discs into the earlobes or the lips or whatever, these are all things that would not be allowed. Now, currently the law says, well, what's the majority medical opinion? Well, in the Western world, say in Europe or Latin America or in the Far East, circumcision is not considered a medical benefit. It is strictly a religious thing. No, the people in those countries, the volumes of studies that have been done trying to show that circumcision has some benefit, the benefits that are claimed are quite minimal, to the point of you probably should not do a surgery as radical as circumcision is to gain those benefits. But even those benefits are hotly contested of whether they're real or not, or what. In the United States, though, you have the American Association of Pediatrics, who does say that the, quote, benefits outweigh the costs and that it's a recommended procedure. But they also cite all kinds of cultural and religious reasons. The people on that board, most of them were Jewish. One of them famously said that he circumcised his own son on his dining room table, and he didn't do it for any medical reason. He did it because he saw, quote, 3,000 years of his ancestors looking over his shoulder. And so even that medical study is relying heavily on cultural and religious considerations, if it matters to the religion and the culture of the parents. So it seems kind of interesting that they have since added, the court would say it's not okay to do this if you're just doing it for cultural reasons, but if you're doing it for medical reasons, then it's a decision that the parents can make. But then the medical associations that are encouraging it are saying it should be allowed for cultural and religious reasons. So we've added this two-step where if a family of, say, Muslims from Pakistan, the Huadi or whatever, want to circumcise their daughters and sincerely believe that it's religiously significant and culturally significant, as it is, that doesn't count. But if they can get enough doctors to say the same thing, essentially that it's um, uh, culturally or religious significant and show it should be permitted, then it suddenly would become. But I think this is all kind of missing the point, because one thing that we do know, and there's all kinds of debates about sexual sensation as adults, and surveys of men who choose to get circumcised later, and men who it's very tricky, and that's worth a whole debate right there. But one thing we do know is that most men, almost all men who are intact when they grow up and they become adults and they get past the age of consent, very, very few of them decide to actually get circumcised. There's a small proportion that need it. It's vastly overprescribed, by the way. There's lots of things that people are getting circumcised for that don't require circumcision. It's just kind of something that in the United States in particular, many doctors that's the go-to. There's some doctors, not all, I'm sure, who just see the foreskin as something that needs to be removed. And there's lots of stories of people being in the locker room and some doctors in the locker room being like, have you ever thought about getting circumcised? As if just the fact that you had a foreskin was reason to do it. But even accounting that, it's something, I think it's like 98% of intact 18-year-olds are going to stay intact for the rest of their lives and be happily so. Intact men enjoy their penises. They don't want to get them cut. Now, most of them don't think about the prepuce and separate it in their head between the rest of the penis. They just enjoy their penis and they have fun with it and they think it's fine. And they don't necessarily break it down into constituent parts and be like, oh, I really like my frenulum or getting this stimulated. It's just one thing, and they don't make a distinction. And there are sometimes when you talk to people in other countries, they sometimes are not even clear like where does the foreskin end and the penis begin. And in the American context, you kind of have the almost the opposite, where there's the penis and then the foreskin is considered separate from the penis. So, for instance, there's this great quote. I think it's in the AAP study saying, circumcision removes the foreskin. It does not harm the penis itself, as if the foreskin was not part of the penis. But the point here, though, is that when that child's born and it's intact, we know that if we wait till that child can consent himself, so we don't have to worry about making a fiduciary decision on his behalf. If we wait until he can make a decision himself, which is legally going to be 18, I would argue that it should be much sooner than that, but as it stands now, legally that would be 18. We know that there's at least a 98% chance, and probably higher, because some of those 2% that are getting circumcised aren't choosing to do it so much as being told by doctors that it needs to be done, that they're going to want to keep their foreskins. And this is true even with people like, so I have a good friend, I've referenced him before, who is Jewish. He's very Jewish. When he was born, he was underweight, and the doctor said, we cannot do any surgeries. And his parents were not sufficiently Orthodox to keep, I mean, he was underweight for a while, so it was a year or two before he was really healthy enough, before that was even a discussion worth having. And they just said to hell with it, and they just forgot about it. Now he's an adult. He's a 30-year-old man. And interestingly enough, he also has phimosis, so he has, what some people will consider a defective foreskin or a less than ideal foreskin, and he's perfectly happy. He has no problem with it. He loves it, and he doesn't want to change it. But he's Jew. He speaks Hebrew. He wants to live in Israel. Uh, he identifies as Jewish. It's a big part of his life, but he also values his intact penis, and he doesn't want to get rid of it. And there's every reason to assume that your newborn baby is going to reach the same conclusion. It's very unlikely that they're going to want to get circumcised. Now, that does happen. There are circumfetishists. There are people who grow up and maybe they have problems with their foreskin. Some of these are treatable, some of them are less so, and some of them might just aesthetically become interested in foreskins. Some of them, or I'm sorry, in circumcised cocks. There's entire forums of people who are dedicated to this, and again, this is not most men. It's just some small minority. And part of the problem with the empirical research is so studies of, say, sexual pleasure after adult circumcision, which again, adult circumcision and child circumcision should not be conflated for physical, practical, medical reasons and for ethical reasons. But leaving that aside, you do have this small minority, at most 2%, but really more like less than 1% of intact men who do want to be circumcised, who don't have a problem. Like these are not guys who have phimosis or balanitis. These are guys who just want to be circumcised for one reason or another. Maybe they just fetishize being cut. Maybe they had a bad experience. In the United States, it's not uncommon for intact men to feel shame and to feel alienation. In fact, it's very rare. Whenever I ask, and I make a point of asking whenever it comes up in conversation, uh, most men will say when they were in middle school and high school, they were ashamed of it. And they wondered. One guy told me he asked his parents, why didn't you get me circumcised? Because I feel like I don't fit in. And now as an adult, he's perfectly happy and he's very glad that he did not get circumcised. I know other guys, this is not uncommon in the States. I've seen this at my gym. Guys who will, when they get naked in front of others in the school showers, in the locker room or whatever, who will fully retract and keep the skin pulled all the way back to appear as circumcised as possible. So this isn't a method of cleaning or hygiene or of like, oh, I'm going to go shower, so I'm going to pull it back so it gets clean. What really happens is people in those cases, they simply don't want to be seen as being intact. They want to look like they're cut. And again, I've talked to people like this. One guy said until he was basically out of high school, and he had to take showers in high school and middle school, he said he would always pull back all the time because he didn't want anyone to know. So sometimes guys like that grow up with a lot of shame, and then they decide to get circumcised. And as an adult, I think they have the right to do that. I maybe disagree with their decision personally, but that ethically they're kind of in the clear there. But what's interesting is all the studies that compare the pleasure of sex are based on this group of people, and that is extreme selection bias. Like, and the direct contrary would be like, well, we could do a similar study of men who restore, find men who are upset about their circumcisions, who bothers, and look, men who decide to restore their foreskins are almost always really upset about it. Like, to the point many of them are depressed, they have severe anger issues against their parents, against doctors, against doctors generally, and they often have fetishes for foreskins, and those people decide to get restoration. And we could do a survey of them once they're done and say, oh, is sex better with a foreskin or without a foreskin? And my guess, the survey hasn't been done. I've seen surveys, like, not empirical studies or whatever, but surveys in forums that have a lot of restored men. They all say it's better. Every single one. I've never heard one who didn't say that. And if you could find one, he would be in the one fraction of 1%. But people would rightfully point out, well, hey, what percentage of cut men even decide to get restored? And we don't know, but the answer is probably less than 1%, probably a lot less than 1%. And so there's pretty extreme selection bias in that, and that makes the science that you can get from that kind of limited. It's not zero. Like, there are functional differences. You can measure how much skin has grown and whatnot. You could probably do tests on the sensitivity of the glands or whatnot, but in terms of like a subjective assessment of sexual pleasure, there's a horrible selection bias problem with that. But guess what? That problem is also present with these surveys of adults who get circumcised, because it's only those who either hate their foreskins for whatever reason or have the most trouble with them or who fetishize being cut the most who are choosing to get circumcised. And this is just an enormous problem. So I think the more there's this interesting thing, because as an adult, as the person making the fiduciary, having responsibility over the child, you could say, well, we're going to get him circumcised, and when he'll grow up, he's not going to mind, because he's not going to remember he has foreskin. He's not going to remember the trauma of the actual act, which I think is an important kind of caveat here. Sure, he might forget then, but that does not justify the pain and suffering that it causes initially. But let's leave that aside for now. Um, but I think that that's wrong, because your choice as a fiduciary medium is to say, of a responsible party, is what would they choose? And if they were allowed to choose themselves once they got to the age of consent, they would almost all choose not to get cut. And I don't think that's controversial. There might be, I mean, there's a lot of cut guys out there who grew up cut, and maybe they've gotten to the position where they're going onto YouTube and they're arguing in favor of circumcision and against foreskin. And those guys will probably say, yes, I'm glad I'm cut, and I would still want to be cut even if I had been uncut. And they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Had they not been cut, they never would have become some kind of or not never, because there's some uncut guys who do this, but the chances that they would become an advocate of circumcision or a proponent of circumcision are quite low. That does happen, but it's a small minority. But also, that is being funneled along by the fact that we have so many guys who are cut. So, and I'm really sorry, guys, I'm not looking too much at the comments here. Uh, I am one of the few Americans that have not been circumcised. Thank you, Dad. Thank you, Dad and Mom. Lucky you. And it's also, it's so, what's interesting is this topic is so taboo that people don't talk about it. So people don't know why they are or aren't. No one ever asked their parents, why did you get me circumcised? Why did you not get me circumcised? I had a hilarious example. I was hooking up with a really attractive man. He was a college student in Michigan, in my hometown, and uh, beautiful uncut dick. And in Michigan, the circumcision rates are very high, so it's very unusual to find a local who is intact. And I said, do you know why you're uncircumcised? Because that's very unusual in the upper Midwest. And he goes, I don't actually know. And he pulled out his phone right then and called his mom. And he's like, hey, Mom, I'm hooking up with this guy. We're having sex. And he wanted to know why I have a foreskin, why I'm not circumcised. And she goes, oh, we thought it was painful and barbaric, and we didn't want to do that to you. And so he goes, okay, thanks, got to go. Hangs up. Then first of all, it's actually kind of illustrative of a point there. Totally anecdotal, so I'm not saying that this could be generalized to everybody. But one of the things that has been observed among infants, that once they get circumcised, it interrupts the infant-mother bond. This is actually empirically shown. They have trouble breastfeeding, they have trouble sleeping, and when you are born, the first person in the world that you recognize that you know is your mother, and you depend on your mother on everything. And there is just this implicit trust. And anything that happens to you that's harmful, you don't know, you don't understand that it's the mohel, you don't understand that it's a doctor, you don't understand anything. You don't understand the pro, you don't understand that you might get a UTI one day and this is helping. All you do is feel excruciating pain and then associate that with your mother. So there's actually a lot of people, there's a lot of mothers, there's a lot of what they call regret mothers who say that their little boy completely changed. He became, like this traumatized, veteran almost as a result of this. And I kind of wonder, again, it's just too anecdotal to prove anything, but here you've got a guy who is, an adult, but he's uncircumcised, and he feels so open with his mom that he can call her up and tell her about the guy he's hooking up with, as we're laying there. And I just know, for me, I would never speak that way to my mother. I don't feel that close to her that I'd be willing to do that. Now, is that because he's uncut and I'm cut? Fair question, but not one that I think we can really answer. Morris and colleagues found the circumcision rate in newborns has declined from 83% in the 1960s to 77% in 2010. I wouldn't really trust Morris because he is the most partisan person on either side of this issue. I think he's more pro-circumcision than even any of the intactivists are against circumcision. He comes out with these meta-analysis pretty much every year, where he's not really doing initial studies, but is just aggregating studies. I'd be curious what country he is, but if that's the United States, that's plausible to me. Uh, Circumcision is becoming less popular in the U.S., so if you're younger, you are less likely to be circumcised than older guys. 100% true, 100% anecdotally observable. If really kind of see the cutoff at 20, guys who are under 20 are much more likely to be intact than guys who are older, unless you go way, way into guys who are born in the 30s. If you can see guys who were born in the 30s, there's a good chance that they are also uncircumcised. But it's really 20s and under. And also enormous regional variation. California, uh, Washington, Oregon, they have pretty high intactivist rates. Maine has a pretty high intactivist rate. Vermont has a pretty high intactivist rate. I just know, living in New Hampshire, if I go to Maine and I go to Vermont, I can find an intact guy to meet in, an hour or less. If I'm in New Hampshire, it actually is quite difficult. But if you go to big cities like Boston, there's a big immigrant communities. Any place where you're going to get lots of Latin Americans, Brazilians, Colombians, obviously, Eastern Europeans. There's a lot of Polish guys in Boston, for instance. So it varies tremendously place to place. But when I go out to Wyoming, it's all cut. Everyone's pretty much cut. So lots of variation there. Yeah, from the same article, infant circumcision should be regarded as equivalent to childhood vaccination, the study says. Yeah, that's just so ridiculous because it doesn't actually protect you from anything like that. You can't, again, that's Brian Morris who's coming up with that. Um, you can catch gonorrhea, you can catch syphilis, you can catch HIV, you can catch there's no disease that you can't catch. You can catch cancer, you can catch UTIs. And again, kind of to show the cultural distinction. If someone said that you could reduce female UTIs by 10% or 50% by getting them circumcised, no one would think that's okay. And I don't know I think the attempt to refer to it as vaccination is just because vaccination is considered really, really valuable. And so they'll say, well, we'll just call it like vaccination. So the HIV studies where they found a 1.6% reduction in the rate of transmission from female to male, they did not find that from male to female, and they certainly didn't find it from male to male. Um, then they call that like vaccination. Like, who's going to here's the flu shot. It will reduce your chances of catching the flu by 1%. Yeah, okay, no one's going to get that. I didn't even know what circumcision was until I was in high school. I went home and thanked my mother for not circumcising me. MT, if you are listening, where are you from? Where in the United States? And if you don't mind, like, what's your age grade? You could just say the decade. I'm kind of curious. Yeah, I mean, most people don't. And there's been all kinds of surveys on this where men misidentify themselves. You've got something like 5% of men think that they're circumcised when they're not, and another 5% think that they're uncircumcised when they're not. And I've met guys like that. That's a real thing, and it's just there's not enough discussion. There's not enough knowledge about it. We've become significantly less naked friendly, platonic nudity, so people are just seeing a lot less of this. They basically have to go online, and images that you see online See, the thing is, there's enough variation among uncircumcised penises that you could go online and look at a picture of an uncut dick, and it doesn't look like you per se, and so you could be like, oh, I must not be that. Uh, yeah, visitors should look up the Morris guy's Cirque fetish history. He is super biased and does whatever he can to push it. So people, Brian Morris, and you can find there's lots of interviews of him. He's from Australia. He's probably what, in his 50s or 60s. And the thing is, Australia has seen a dramatic decline in circumcision rates, basically starting in the 70s, where they were, I don't know, probably in the 80% range, and are now, I'm pretty sure it's under 5% at this point. So quite a great reduction. And so it's one of those countries, and New Zealand's another one, where there's a very clear generational gap. It's much clearer than it is in the United States or Canada. And they've actually done studies. Again, this is one of the interesting things. There was a study in Canada, for instance, of doctors and whether or not they recommended circumcision. And the number one variable that determined whether they did or didn't was the circumcision status of the doctor. Basically, doctors who were uncircumcised did not recommend circumcision. Doctors that were circumcised did, but they're looking at exactly the same medical data. Uh, Now, there also have been studies in Australia that show that, favoring circumcision is much is viewed that the older generation of men who are circumcised, they favor circumcision, and they are a little bit, what's the word? They're threatened by the fact that the younger generation, older men are always threatened by the younger, more virile men who are going to surpass them physically or whatever. But on top of that, the younger men have entire intact penises, and the older men don't. Morris is in that, and I have always heard that he was a circumfetishist, but I've never confirmed that. So if anyone has any kind of link to show that Brian Morris is that, I want to see it. I've also heard the same thing about Edgar Schoen, who's now dead, but that he was in a group of physicians that would swap videotapes of circumcisions that they like to watch. But I don't know if that's true. I haven't seen proof of that. Sorry, you guys are getting ahead of me. I asked my parents, and they said that it's just done because that's they trusted the doctor. Yeah, that's most people. And I talked about this with Poe the person. We did a video on circumcision and foreskin. And the thing is, like, your parents are not doing it for malicious reasons. There might be psychological reasons why the father, especially, could be like, hey, I want him to look like me. I don't want to be intimidated by an intact son who has more of a penis than I do. And the mother, if she's say a doctor who's done circumcision, or she has other children who have been circumcised, there's a good chance that she could, want to rationalize her previous decisions. But in general, I think they're doing what they think is best, or what they're being told what they think is best. So I know I personally don't have a lot of antipathy towards my parents about this. I wish to hell that they hadn't done it, but it was before the internet. I don't see how they could know. Uh, in the UK, the law requires consent of both parents, so it is still effectively legal, but the renewed awareness over here is to throw male mutilation into the same box as female mutilation. Yeah, North Rider. Well, I think that they are principally the same. There are obviously some practical differences between the two. Basically, there's a greater range of surgeries for female circumcision, some of which are much more mild than male circumcision, that involve like ritual nicks, pinpricks, stuff like that, scrapes. And then it gets way, way more invasive, just removing all the external genitalia, essentially, and infibulation would be the extreme. But the problem here is, though, in the UK, if you pair them together, there's a good chance that a male circumcision could be greatly reduced or banned or nearly banned. I think that people are going to really hesitate with the Jewish question on this, and perhaps the Muslim question. Muslims have an easier out because they do it at older ages where consent becomes less of an ethical issue. But the problem, people are attempting to do it in the United States to pair female and male circumcision. And the problem here is that male circumcision is sufficiently popular that we know in at least some cases, like the AAP, for instance, they would be more willing to basically legalize female circumcision than they would be to ban male circumcision or restrict it. So outright ban is probably not on the table, but there's more willingness to tolerate female circumcision than there is to restrict male circumcision. And that's just kind of like the sad facts at the moment. Um, Yeah, I mean, FGM was basically a federal crime in the United States since 1996. The law said even a ceremonial pinprick, quote unquote, was a felony. This got overturned about a year ago, but basically because the judge said that these laws are this. these are already illegal in the states, and the federal government can't make a law about this. Here's an interesting thing: some people think it's already illegal because it's assault. Like if you just go up to somebody and you start poking them with a knife, you know, if I come up to you and I just start jabbing you with a knife, and I don't, let's say I don't kill you, I'm just, jabbing you, leaving little scars. Yeah, that's an assault. And if I do that to a baby, that's also an assault. And and there could be extenuating circumstances. Like let's say uh, you've got a tumor and you're going to die, and this is the only way to save you. Sure, people would probably make an exception, but that's not what's happening in circumcision. So there's actually some activists out there who believe that the laws already prohibit this from happening, that it's a form of assault, or even more specifically sexual assault, because you're doing it to genitals. Which I think there's a good argument there, because let's say your doctor just goes to the baby boy and just starts fondling him, and oh, I'm just going to play with his penis, and because I want to. People are like, oh shit, you can't do that, you're a pedophile. But if he cuts off the foreskin, they're like, oh, good job, he's not going to have to clean it. Right? The only people who worry about cleaning foreskins are cut guys. Right? Uncut guys aren't going around saying, oh my god, it's so hard, it's so difficult, I have to scrub it for hours a day. It doesn't bother them. It bothers cut guys. Cut guys say, oh god, I'm just glad I don't have to deal with that. They don't even know what they're saying though. There's talk of making male general musicians equally a criminal act prior to adulthood. Yeah, I mean, there's movements for that, but we're just the problem is it's going to fly in the face of religious intolerance. I just think there is an argument there, because religious belief, no matter how well established and how sincere, doesn't give you carte blanche to do whatever you want. So, for instance, it doesn't give you the right to do female circumcision, even when it's much more mild than male circumcision, as indeed many types of female circumcision are. And there's a whole host of other things that it wouldn't allow you to do, no matter how much you believed in it. So, I mean, people say, "Oh, religion is not a get out of jail free card." And I would say that amputating healthy body parts is definitely a big line. It's that's the last line you cross before you're talking about killing someone, right? Because there are people who are like, hey, the millennium's coming, the rapture's coming, I don't want the world is full of sin, I don't want my child to suffer, I'm going to kill them. There are people who could honestly have that belief, and we would not say that that's acceptable. Uh, uh, I remember reading also like about a tribe in Africa, the Hasda, who would cut the faces of their babies because they didn't like them to cry. When they cried, if they cry, it aggravates the wound, so they stop crying. So when they're adults, they're just covered in all these little scars on their face. And these little nicks aren't going to kill them. They're just tiny little scars. And like I said, this is our culture, it's our tradition, it's how we raise our children, and that would just not be okay. That would not be acceptable. But the wounds that they're inflicting, aside from the fact that they're on their face and very visible, are much more mild and minor than removing the foreskin. My mom is a single parent, and all of my brothers are uncut. We also all have a very good relationship with our mother as adults. And I do wonder if there's any kind of research, any way that that could be researched. I'm sure it hasn't been. But most of the neonate research we have on the effects of circumcision are that it makes the infants much more intolerant, or much less tolerant to pain. They're much easier for them to feel pain, to suffer. And also, that interrupts their sleeps, raises cortisol levels significantly. So it's basically stressing the child, which makes sense. And I'm all for stressing the child if that's what you have to do to save its life. Like if you have to give it open heart surgery without anesthetic, or else it will die, then that is a fair choice, and it would be reasonable to assume as an adult that they would choose to want to do that. Um, and just to bring it back to the title about antinatalism. So antinatalism isn't necessarily in favor of abortion, because it's just saying you should not create children, period, because they're going to suffer. And I thought about this. The prominent Australian antinatalist was interviewed by Sam Harris, and it was interesting because basically he was saying, look, life is suffering, and I'm not advocating killing people who exist. That would be wrong. And I'm not advocating even abortion, because that's a life that exists too. I'm not sure if he's against abortion, but he's saying, look, you should just not create life because it's suffering. And what Sam Harris kind of reaction, and this would be my reaction too, and I think most people's, is yes, life is suffering. He's something like a secular Buddhist, so he would definitely believe that. But there's also all these great parts of life, and on net, most people would agree that it's worth that. Now, you do have some people who commit suicide, but it's a small minority of the population that even attempts to do so, and sometimes that's not even necessarily an indictment of their entire lives. Like they could have a really nice life, and when they're 50, they could kill themselves, and that doesn't prove that they think that they should never have existed. That just proved that at that moment they no longer wanted to exist. So, it's kind of this very similar question of, well, you're saying that we should not create life because it's going to suffer, but we kind of know that if you do create it, there's a really high chance, not 100%, but a really high chance that it's going to be happy with its life. And this kind of comes into another argument that people raise again about circumcision, where people will say they'll raise a hypothetical, and the hypothetical could be a real thing that could really happen. So, for the instance of circumcision, I want to get him circumcised because what if he has phimosis? Well, that's totally true. People can have phimosis. I know people have phimosis. I was talking to a friend of mine who has phimosis for a couple hours yesterday, who lives in Europe, and and some of those guys who have phimosis, it's not a problem, and they're perfectly fine, and they're happy, and they don't want to get cut. They actually like how they are. And others, it is a problem. And in the United States, they'll probably be told they need to get circumcised. In other places, there are other things you can do. There's circumcision is the most extreme remedy for that problem. It is to the extent that it is a problem. But the thing is, with all hypotheticals, you have to rate their probability. So when you have your baby sitting there, there's no way to know if it's going to have phimosis. And you have to weigh that possibility with what's the likelihood. So it's not 100% that it's going to have phimosis. It's like maybe 2% that it's going to have phimosis. And it's maybe like 25% of that it's going to need circumcision, maybe even less. And so for the antinatalists, they could also say, well, why would you have a child? Because the child could end up committing suicide. It could end up having a horrible life that it can't stand and killing itself. And that is true. That could happen. But what are the odds that that happens? Quite low. And so it comes back to when we're making the decision, the parents who are vested with the authority to make the decision, or if it's not the parents, the guardian or whatnot, they can't make the decision. It really, I'm not going to say they can't, because legally they can, but it does not make sense for them to make decisions assuming that the most unlikely things are what's going to happen. We know that the most likely thing, if you don't cut him, is that he's going to be happy that way and he's not going to get cut. That he's not going to have a problem. And if he does have a problem, the chances that that problem requires circumcision are quite low. Not impossible, but low. Similarly, we know that, like, if you conceive a child, they're probably not going to ever become suicidal. They might, but the odds are quite low. And so to just assume, well, I shouldn't create life because there's a chance it could suffer this way is erroneous. Uh, Question is, why is circumcision still legal? The reason it is still legal is because it is culturally accepted, and law and politics follows culture. And it is a self-replicating meme. Men who are circumcised become pro-circumcision. They are threatened, I think, psychologically with the idea. I mean, it's one of the oldest things in the world when you get abused to want to cycle that abuse. If instead of circumcising all of our babies, let's just say we had a cultural practice where we, molested them instead, uh, and we just did that systematically to all our babies, uh, a lot of them would become molesters when they grow up. I mean, or if we beat them, they would become bullies. Well, not literally all of them, but many. And when you circumcise guys, they tend to want to rationalize what happened, and they don't want to. And there's a certain amount that you're threatened by a guy who's got everything and you don't. And here's the other thing, because people, again, going back to this argument, well, but if we do get him circumcised, he's not going to miss his foreskin because he's not going to know that he had one. Or if he does, like, know it, like, technically he's not going to know it viscerally, so it's not going to really have any kind of sway on him. The problem there is that, and to give you an example, if it was just your kid, say you're in the UK, and you say, well, he's going to grow up and everyone he knows is going to be uncircumcised. And so he's going to know he's missing something, and that's going to actually feel quite alienating. And you do get this from guys who grow up cut in the UK. Often they kind of resent it for that reason. Um, But what if you say, well, most of the people in the culture are going to be also circumcised? So, another kind of example, you cut off someone's ear, they're not going to miss their ear. But if they grow up where everyone else has two ears and they only have one, they're going to feel like a little left out and a little weird. But if everyone has their ear cut off, they're going to feel like, oh, well, this is just normal. What's the big deal? I don't have it any less good or bad than anyone else. So the problem with circumcision is that it's never been 100%. And so there's always been the chance that you will realize that you're missing something, even if there was no concerted effort to tell you. So people like Wayne Griffiths, who's an early intactivist, I think he died maybe a year or two ago, who wrote The Joy of Uncircumcised. Oh, that's John Bigelow. Anyway, one of the early intactivists, he talks about the first, he had no clue. His parents never told him about it. But he saw one of his friends in the locker room, or, playing around, and he was like, oh, what is that? His penis looks different than mine. And this kind of leads to that realization. And the thing is, that's going to come. And I think one of the things that's kind of pressing the intactivist movement forward is that because of the internet, the chances that someone bumps into that is much higher. So, when I grew up in the 80s and 90s and essentially pre-internet days, I never saw any uncut dicks. I never met anyone who was uncut at least that I knew of. And I was seeing all the boys at summer camp and at the pool and whatnot, and like everyone was cut just like me, and there was no epiphany to be had. That is not likely to happen anymore. The rates have come down far enough that the chances that you're going to be surrounded only by cut guys forever is actually quite low. And in fact, in some places, being cut makes you in a minority. Again, thank you to Grindr. I met a guy who was from Bangor, Maine, which is not one of the bigger cities in Maine. And he said he was on a high school football team, and it was 2/3 uncut, 1/3 cut. And so the cut guys actually got made fun of by the uncut guys who were in the majority. Now, you don't not necessarily be in the minority when you're circumcised, but you're not going to be able to pretend like that there isn't something that you're missing. And this is, again, especially true now because of the internet. So this idea that like, well, if we cut it, he's never going to know. Well, he is going to know. He's going to figure it out, probably sooner rather than later. Uh, Antinatalism. So the reason I picked antinatalism, because I think it's kind of similar. I don't want to just debate antinatalism other than to say the idea that because people are going to suffer, we should assume that they would rather not exist, and so we won't create them, I think is faulty, because we know that most people, if they do come into existence, are going to be glad that they exist. Most people are not going to say, thank God I wasn't aborted. Thank God that, they're happy that they're around. And the kind of the parallel is that with circumcision is that most men, if they are left intact, are happy that they're intact. But some of my cousins are from the mid-states and they still have their foreskins. The reason is because they had Amish for midwives and they were born at home. Well, that's very unusual to be born at home with an Amish midwife, but there you go. Midwest is still one of the great bastions of circumcision. It's still quite common. Sorry, guys, just confirming plans for the night. We still got some time though. But okay, people are talking about the Alabama marriage licenses. So yeah, apparently Alabama has just gone full libertarian. The strict libertarian argument has always been, at least for me, that the government state should not be involved in marriage licenses at all. The history of marriage licenses are quite disgusting, actually. It's about miscegenation and preventing race mixing, and just another thing for them to regulate, which really has nothing to do with them. It should be between you and them and any church that you want to get involved with. It's just a contract. And the problem in Alabama apparently is that people were refusing to, whatever district, not district attorneys, but the bureaucrats at the bottom level who had to certify gay marriage licenses were refusing to do it, but that was the law. They have to do it because the Supreme Court said so. And so what they're going to basically do is say, okay, nobody needs it. And I think that is quite actually great. I never, if we were having this discussion a year ago, I would have said that's never going to happen. I mean, obviously that's the libertarian ideal. I think that's the best solution, but that's just not where the zeitgeist of the world is, and ended up happening in Alabama. So good on them, even if they did it for the wrong reasons. Oh, no, no. Okay, guys, let's leave the let's not have a vaccine. I don't want to have a vaccination debate. I just don't. So I'm not going to answer. So like, definitely an ignorance issue. Too little is known, discussed. It must be stopped by education and go hand in hand with intact ownership education, i.e., cleaning care, nature times retraction. Absolutely, Ron. I totally agree. I think that one thing that needs to happen is that uncut, intact men need to become more vocal, because basically the cut side of the debate is that uncut guys are dirty, that they're disgusting, that they're disease ridden, and also that foreskin has no value. And the thing is, they can speak to all of those things. What got me initially interested in this was talking to intact men in Europe. The very first one was in the UK, the second one was in Iceland, both of them straight. And my first question to them was, how often do you get infected? Because what I had been taught, literally taught in school, was that foreskins breed disease, they get infected constantly. If you have a foreskin, you're going to be sick all the time. So that's what I believed. And I said, well, they do it, so obviously there's a reason. And it sounds like it would be icky and gross. So I talked to them, and they were like, what are you talking about? We never have a problem. It's not an issue. It's not something that we have to deal with. It's not a thing. And I was like, okay, so at the very least, and that's not entirely, like, you can have problems with your foreskin and you do have to clean it, just not as often. I mean, it's not a big deal. It doesn't take, they don't spend any more time in the shower than anyone else does. Um, it usually takes 1 or 2 seconds where you're standing in the water anyway. That's about it. You just pull back, rinse, it's done. Um, so that was my first kind of, the claims that were made were clearly exaggerated in terms of the downside. But then the next piece of that puzzle was the upside, and that was more. I did talk to people about that. I mean, I did ask when I knew these guys, and these were straight guys again. Uh, and I remember, one telling me how much he liked when his girlfriend kissed the tip of his penis, and I was like, okay, well, when a guy kisses the tip of my penis, it's like nothing. It's like you don't feel, like you can feel it happen, but it's like that's not erogenous. Like, and he was like, no, if someone kisses the tip of his foreskin, like his whole body shudders. I'm like, okay. And again, not every uncut guy has that exact same reaction, but it's not uncommon at all. And then meeting uncut guys, and that was the big eye opener. Like as soon as that started happening, I was like, holy shit, they are feeling things that I'm not, and that other uncut guys are not. And I'm not. I mean, if uncut guys want to start becoming more sexually promiscuous to share their knowledge, that's fine. But they don't have to do that. It would just be better if they talked about it more. If we had more guys who are uncircumcised, and especially Americans, I think it helps more if it's Americans, but making YouTube videos talking about it. And there's a few, but not many. There's a handful. I've found, like, and I regularly check. Maybe not even half a dozen. It's very rare. I mean, there's probably more references where people will say, "Oh yeah, I'm uncut," but guys actually talking about it's quite rare. Talking about it, being open about it, and like Ron, you are absolutely right. There's a big problem with people talking about premature retraction, cleanliness. Like, there's a lot of misnomer. Zombie Tools cameo, yeah. Well, actually, Zombie Tools, I did a video on that a long time ago, and that got like 20,000 views. Uh, Cleaning my foreskin actually feels really good. It's definitely not a chore. Yeah, so I mean, there you go. I mean, and that's what we need, Patrick. Verbeek, if you're American, then you need to talk about that more. If you're not American, you need to pretend to be an American and say that more. Because it is kind of ridiculous. You'll have this in one of the Facebook groups I'm in. It's a very strong mix between Americans and British people, and then other people. So it wouldn't surprise me if it was literally 50-50 in terms of cut and uncut. And being it's a gay group, so gay men tend to have a much higher rating towards foreskin than anybody else, essentially. And I dare say that's because of experience. That they actually have a much better idea. You don't have firsthand knowledge of what a foreskin's like, but you do have secondhand knowledge, which gets you quite a long way. Uh, but you would get in these debates, and like these pro circumcision cut guys who don't have a foreskin, some of them who've never even seen one, would just go on and on and on about, oh my god, it's so hard to clean. It's like they speak from personal experience, where they have no clue what they're talking about. And then some guy from England would be like, it takes like 2 seconds, and like it feels good. Like, I like cleaning it. It's like nice, you know. So that we need more of that happening, because then it just makes the claims sound like bullshit. Blah blah blah. So I'm way behind on the chat, guys. But I get this sense that the antinatalists are just misanthropes. I really do. And it was funny, again, to draw maybe a forced parallel in this case, but the doctors who popularized circumcision as a medical thing, they were not misanthropes, but they were sexanthropes, if that's a word. They really did. It was in the Victorian age. Sexual pleasure was seen as sinful and harmful. You know, if you were enjoying sex, it wasn't just against God. Like, it would give you problems. You could have schizophrenia. You could become effeminate. You could lose your energy. You could get syphilis. You know, there's all kinds of things that it could do. And circumcision was seen as a way of curbing that. See, and that's another interesting thing. Initially, it was like, yes, foreskins are pleasurable. Having a foreskin enhances your sexual pleasure. This is something you can find all the way back to Maimonides and even Aristotle. And in the 19th century, when this became popularized, right? The chain of history, the first dominoes that is still falling today was, we should do this to reduce sexual pleasure. And the problem was, you could not convince adult men to do it. It was very hard to go to a 30-year-old and be like, yes, it would be better for you if we circumcised you. But you could convince them to do it to their child. And that's another kind of clue about the fiduciary media. You have all these people, these intact fathers, initially, and this is not true now, but intact fathers who would not be willing to do it to themselves, but they were willing to do it to their children, which is a good indicator that they were not making, what was philosophically in the best interest of the child. But again, a doctor is telling them that, so maybe debatable. And so this idea that foreskin is bad and it gives sexual pleasure and so it should be reduced. And this was one of the main arguments from really that's 1860, 1870, and then from then on is when it starts to kind of steadily grow. And you also had along with it people claiming that it protected against diseases, but those diseases kind of interchanged. And then initially it was syphilis and spermidorrhea, which is a totally made up disease. And then later it was cancer, and then UTIs, and now the big popular one is AIDS, HIV. But in the 1960s, you get the sexual revolution, where all of a sudden sexual pleasure is not bad. It's good. It's not something to be shunned. And then suddenly the argument for circumcision changes, and they stop saying that it reduces sexual pleasure, but it's now a popular thing that's done to everyone. It's culturally accepted. In fact, it's culturally normative. So if you're not circumcised, it's bad. And the tune completely changes to, not that it reduces sexual pleasure, that it makes it easier to focus on the Torah or whatever, but that there's no difference sexually, that they feel the same. Or even, and this is the really weird one, well, they'll be like, no, it makes it better because you can feel less so you can last longer. So all these people who argue until they're blue in the face that circumcision doesn't have any effect, and then they'll be like, no, it does have effect. It's a good effect because you can last longer. And I'm like, this is the wonky. It's kind of wonky because a guy who's uncut, there's things you can do, there's things you can learn to make it last longer or less. You just have way more options. There's more things you can do. There's more you can feel. It's just a bigger, richer experience in every way that matters. And even if it did mean that you went quicker, even if it did mean that you didn't last as long, I would take 8 minutes of bliss over 10 minutes of mundane sex any day. But that's not even the trade, because it's fully possible to learn. I don't consider myself pro-life because I am an antinatalist. I prefer the term anti-abortion. I don't consider myself pro-life because I am an antinatalist. I prefer the term anti-abortion. Huh. I am also anti-circumcision as well. This is kind of another interesting thing, because I've heard most of the intactivists are pretty left wing, and when I've gone to like intactivist events, and I haven't gone to many, but it's pretty much a bunch of like lesbians and new age people, and like I definitely feel like I probably don't fit in here, and that we could get into a huge argument about Bernie Sanders at any moment. And I assume that most of them are probably pro-abortion. And I remember seeing a post of an intactivist saying, "Wow, I really believe in intactivism as a human right, and it's a human rights issue, and it really motivates me. And I also see it connected to abortion, and I really also believe that abortion is a human right." And I'm like, so it's wrong to cut a newborn's penis a little bit, not a little bit. I'm not trying to minimize it, but it's okay to kill, a new. I'm like, okay, I feel like there's some cognitive dissonance there. That's something that, um, yeah. Systematic molestation happens in some cultures. Yep. Dr. Chris Ryan has argued that molestation is not inherently bad due to the people in those cultures turning out okay. Not a good argument, in my honest opinion. Uh, yeah, except you say that, except then they're all molesters. I guess the argument is everyone's a molester, then it's not a problem. Um, I do think, look, and I've made this very clear, I don't think that prepubescents can consent. I think that postpubescents, many of them can, but it depends on their personal abilities and their personal, every individual is different. That said, and I'm not, this is going to be misconstrued or whatever, um, prepubescents are not always sexually non-entities. Now, because they'll do stuff with each other. I don't know about everyone else here, but I know that when I was a young child, there was a little playing that happened. It wasn't very often, it wasn't very frequent, but it was like, two young children, two prepubescents doing stuff, and that's not that uncommon. And I don't know. Obviously, that is a difference between if it's two adults, but I think it's hard to have a kind of honest discussion if people just deny that outright and say that never happens or that can't happen. That happens, and it's probably not even that rare. I know lots of people are not going to admit it, but I think it's probably not that rare. And that does not justify pedophilia because you're talking about two little kids. But I think we have to understand that it's. And I remember even Oprah, honestly enough, not that I like Oprah, but she said one interesting thing that kind of surprised me in that Michael Jackson documentary about pedophilia. And she said, "You look, when the pedophile does it right, it feels good. It's not like the pedophile is gonna grab a kid and just horribly rape them and have there be blood and be so painful. I mean, that can happen, but what's more likely to happen is they're going to do stuff that the child perceives as pleasurable. Not always. They might find it threatening and dangerous and be terrified the entire time, but not necessarily. And I think it took courage for her to say that because that sounds like you're justifying it, which you're not. But you're just acknowledging that like this is a type of influence that you can have that's not necessarily going to raise red flags immediately on the part of the child. Circumcised, but if not born in a religion that practice it, then don't. Um, but yeah, what's interesting is the religious exception, Adirondack guy, is that people will say, well, there's a religious exception, and then they just generalize it to say anyone can do it. So there's no countries that say it's it's acceptable for religious reasons that then just don't generally say anyone can do it. Looking at Jews in the United States, most of them do not have ceremonial circumcisions. They don't wait to the eighth. They have historically not only not practiced circumcision, but for 1800 years considered it, tantamount to evil or disgusting or gross or barbaric or whatever, satanic even. And then it got popularized in the United States. Now, it didn't get popular in the United States because of a religious awakening. People weren't discovering the passages in the Bible about circumcision, Genesis 1:17 or whatever it was, and be like, oh my God, we should be doing this. Because it's always been understood, well, that's for the Jews, and there's a New Testament, and you don't get into good with God because you follow all these stupid rules. You do it through Christ and whatnot. But because it just became popular for medicalized reason, and you have I'm Lutheran, and it's like that's nothing. That means nothing. You're like no tenet of Lutheranism or baptism or Methodism or Protestantism or Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxism that says you should be circumcised. But people think, well, I am, and I'm religious, therefore that must be why. Uh, ba, ba, ba. Yeah, and I also agree. How do you be born into a religion? Because like, there's lots of things I know the Supreme Court has kind of said your religion, you can do whatever you want to yourself, but you can't do it to other people. So if your religion says, well, I'm allowed to have sex with virgins, you can't just go around and start, raping 12-year-old girls, even if your religion says that's okay because it's you. You can do it to yourself. Doing it to your child, that's again, you want to get religious tattoos, that's illegal. You want to circumcise your daughter, that's illegal. Right, so they have this religion exception, but the only thing they really allow is circumcision. I put this point blank to a Jewish guy once. I was just like, what other healthy body parts are you allowed to cut off as a religious, with a religious justification? He goes, none. It's the only one. So it's definitely special pleading. Uh, bah, bah, bah. Bloodstained Men is made up entirely of feminists and man-haters. On their Facebook group, I got into arguments with women who think that because they carried a child, they have a right to decide if they want to circumcise the child. So I know who the Bloodstained Men are, but I've never interacted with them personally. So I don't know if they have a monolithic belief or not. They do seem kind of new agey, left-wing people to me, and that, I mean, I agree with them on this issue, so good for them. And I'll take the William Lloyd Garrison approach. We don't have to agree on everything. If we have a topic that we agree on, then we can cooperate on that topic without sacrificing our principles on everything else, right? Just because they might be a Bernie Sanders supporter, that doesn't mean I'm not willing to engage with them and help with them on this topic or any other topic that we happen to agree on. So yes. Thanks. I can't read your name. Regella Machine. Watching my videos for years. I appreciate it. It's been interesting. I'm not a huge channel or anything like that. I don't have hundreds of thousands or millions of views or anything like that. But running the numbers, it is kind of like I have like a high school, like I have one school district worth of people who listen to my stuff and have listened to my stuff, and that's kind of weird sometimes. But yeah, pre 1800s Christians were lit. Yeah, there's actually the Marked in Your Flesh book. For for those interested, I did a review on this. Marked in Your Flesh, and this is by Leonard Glick. So Leonard Glick is Jewish, and he is a doctor. He went to medical school, and he did actually do, I think he said he did 3 circumcisions, and then he stopped. He didn't care about circumcision, but he stopped because he got into anthropology, and he became an anthropologist. Went back to grad school and ended up doing a lot of work, I think, in Australasia or Melanesia. And witnessing their genital mutilations, they did different types there. They would do like dorsal slits. They also did forms of circumcision. And his colleagues would talk about how ridiculous it was and how backwards and whatnot. And then they said, well, we do genital mutilation as well. We cut off foreskins, and you're like, no, that's totally fine. That's not weird. That's not genital mutilation. We're doing that for medical reasons, which is bullshit. They're not doing it for medical reasons, but that got him interested in the topic, and now he's since written this book. But Semite people who perform these barbaric acts where they cut their baby foreskins off, and then the what's now considered, it's quite radical and it's not widely practiced, but the metzitza bepe, where the moil cleanses the wound by sucking the blood out of the penis with his mouth. There's a lot of people who think this gave rise to ideas that Jews kill children, or that they were vampires or sucked blood, which I guess would be literally true in that case because they are sucking blood. Um, so but yeah, basically the image, the Jews were defined by circumcision, and that's actually kind of later anthropologists have said, when Jewish communities who vary in their practices, they don't all wear the same clothing, they don't all have the same hairstyles, they don't all practice the same their interpretations of what's kosher. I mean, everyone talks about how Jewish Ben Shapiro is. Where's his fucking beard? And I was told that he has a thing where, like, if he uses a buzzer but not a blade, so he can use like he can use a razor on like below his chin line, but above he has to use like some weird, I mean, I jokingly call it just a Jew excuse to get away with it, but like they vary. The point is they vary in their practices, but the one thing that they all agreed on was the primacy of circumcision. And so in the 19th century, especially in Germany, but in other parts of Europe, kind of as a prelude to the Zionist movement, you had a lot of Jewish people who were becoming more nationalist, to be frank, right? You have all these different communities that made up these, religious communities, whether they're Jewish or Polish or whatever. And then you have these states growing up, and you had a lot of this nationalism. Of course, the Jews didn't have a nation. And some of them said, well, maybe we should get a nation. And that's kind of where Zionism starts. But others said, well, we should just integrate as much as possible with the nations that we live in. And so if you're talking about German Jews, like, they spoke German, they read Goethe and Schiller, and they maybe read the Torah too and could read Yiddish or maybe Hebrew, and so they were kind of a little bicultural, but they still identified as Germans, a lot of them. And they said we should. There were questions: should we integrate all the way, or maybe should we integrate a little bit and just kind of keep? And then some of them, more reformed, were like, well, let's keep bits. We'll keep the bits that we really like or they're really important. And there were a couple. So the Reformed Jews ended up like, I mean, they got rid of the rabbinate. So Reformed Jews, they go to temple. They don't go to synagogue, right? So they said, oh, okay, the rabbinate, that's a medieval thing, and it's not in the Quran, or sorry, it's not in the Old Testament. But you got, it's not in Torah. Um, but you had a few. Oh, and one of the early things is the Metzitza B'Peh, where they suck the blood. A lot of them, because they knew that was spreading like cholera, they said, well, let's maybe not do that. Let's maybe suck it through a glass tube instead, so it's a little less dirty. Some reformers said, hey, we're getting a lot of shit for this. Like, the other Europeans, our fellow German, compatriots, they look at this as very bizarre and barbaric and weird and anti-human, and there's actually a lot of literature among like Europeans fighting the Turks where circumcision was like imposed on Christians as a punishment, which in the Bible, uh, I think circumcision is mentioned 4 times in the Old Testament, twice as like a right of Jewish, being a Jew, and twice more as an act of degradation. You have your enemy and you defile them by circumcising them and just showing, you're not real man or whatever. So this would happen to Christians. So there's a couple of accounts by like British men, or Englishmen rather, because Britain wasn't really a concept then, who get captured by the Turks, in naval warfare in the Mediterranean by some Barbary pirates or whoever, who then get circumcised and who say like, I'm not a man anymore. Like, I've been robbed of the best part of my masculine identity. And Jews in Germany were like, well, maybe we should. A few started saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this. This is one of those traditions that we should abandon. And the backlash on that was absolutely nope, 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 nope. This is, of all the things that all the Reformed Jews will shed everything but that. Now, I think this is still true. That's probably the hardest thing for them to shed, but they are shedding it. So many Jews are urban liberal, fucking San Francisco soy boy, whatever. That I have books about Jews trying to end circumcision, and most of the authors, we're talking about Leonard Glick, we're talking about Ron Goldman. They're Jewish and they're strongly anti-circumcision, and they kind of have a parallel dialogue. They have the stuff that they write for the goy. This is why circumcision is bad, and this is why it should end. And then they write a different book for the Jews because they want it to stop both ways. You've got people like Eric Clapper, who did like a one-man show at Harvard against circumcision and lost his job because it was deemed anti-Semitic, even though he's Jewish. So like, just like in every other topic, Jewish intellectuals kind of lead the way or have disproportionate representation anyway. But I don't. They've got a lot of work to do, especially in Israel, because then it kind of ties into nationalism a little bit more. My wife is an activist. She was a pagan and a red. Yeah, that sounds about like what I saw. It sounds about what I saw. You don't see the It's weird because you might think that like the middle of the road, go to church every Sunday wasps would be like, oh well, the Bible is pretty clear. The New Testament is pretty clear that circumcision is not something that you need to do, and even something that you probably shouldn't do. It's just they're so traditionalist, and they view circumcision as traditional, even though its history is far from ancient in the United States. It just goes back a little ways. Um, that I feel like they should be the ones having that discussion. The only other like right wing attack on it has been some states. I heard in Arizona, to save money in like Medicaid, they cut circumcision out of things that are covered by the policy, which is a wonderful thing. And I thought Northrider, I thought you were going to go, and here you are again. It's certainly a weird irony that two religions divided by so much war are so completely united in their justification of mutilating their respective children. Yeah, well, I mean, they're Abrahamic religions, right? They're all children of Abraham. They came from the same area. There's a lot of like stuff that Muhammad was just kind of picking and choosing from Christianity and Judaism. And yeah. What are your thoughts on allowing people to sue parents and doctors for circumcision? Oh, hey, Jared. It is good to see you as always. And also, Jared, I'll answer that in a second. Mormons. Uh, I've met a decent number of Mormons who are uncircumcised. And I believe that there is some kind of doctrinal reason for this. That some, because some of them have told me I'm LDS and I'm uncircumcised because I'm LDS. Now, most LDS people are cut, I think, in Utah, but I think there is some kind of doctrinal dispute there. Um, but I never got the details. But I mean, the Mormons I met who were uncut had really nice uncut dicks. So Mormons are very beautiful and are kind of a little bit inbred maybe too. But anyway, so to get to your question, I absolutely believe that when you circumcise a child, that is a crime, and that they are entitled to restitution, and that you did something without their consent that was not necessary, that you violated your fiduciary rights, excuse me, your fiduciary responsibilities. You made a choice that that child would almost certainly not have made if they had been able to consent, and I think that that can be demonstrated. Now, you might have an argument that, yeah, circumcision of the heart. I've heard this. I've seen, when I do videos, it's not necessarily LDS, but other Christians saying circumcision is of the heart, um, not of the flesh. But as this book title implies, for many others, it means of the flesh. But you could make the argument that even though it's not in the best interest of the child, if the parent thinks it's in the best interest of the child, is that not okay? And I think that the answer to that is no, because like, what if they think it's in the best interest of their daughter to get her circumcised? Nobody would say that's okay, even if the parents sincerely believe that, and even if they are granted, because the same exact logic, like if you circumcise a little girl when she's a baby, she's never going to miss her clit. Never, ever. She's never going to be like, where's my, I mean, there's only a small chance that she's going to miss it. So she's going to grow up and she's never going to know what it feels like to get her bean flicked or whatever. I don't know what happens with, I mean, it's kind of icky for me to talk about, but there you go. So yes, I absolutely think that you can sue. Now, people have tried. The only way people have won is if they had so-called botched circumcisions, or if doctors did circumcisions that the parents did not want or didn't ask for. So it's so routine in some hospitals that there have actually been cases where parents told doctors not to do it and they just did it anyway. And then actually up until like the 90s, it was rare that they even like asked for consent. They were just doing them. And there was actually a case, this is kind of ironic, where a Jewish religious family, they had a baby. They wanted to circumcise him, but they wanted to circumcise him on the 8th day in the ritualistic way, not in the hospital, but with the mohel and the whatever. And the hospital just circumcised him, like, medically. And the family was, holy shit, no, we were going to have this religious ceremony and you just completely ruined it because you cut it off in the hospital and not on the kitchen table, which is where you're supposed to do it. You had a doctor do it with a scalpel instead of a mohel do it with his thumbnail, which is how they do it. Um, and they sued and they won a lot, and then that's when he started getting actual consent forms. Now there's whole things about informed consent where they're going to the parents and the parents, they're just telling the parents get this done. Sometimes they're having women sign them when they're like on drugs, like they just gave birth and they have no clue what's going on. They've also had issues where you have like Latino families who maybe don't speak English and they're giving them consent forms and they're checking the boxes, and then their sons are getting circumcised, you know, without the parents even knowing that's what's going on. So people have sued successfully along those lines. But if you're just talking about a normal, non-botched circumcision, and what counts as a botch is another interesting question, because yes, there's the worst type where a baby dies or a penis is removed, which has happened. And there are horror stories like that. Thankfully or not thankfully, they're relatively uncommon. But the more mundane injuries they're actually pretty common. Skin bridges. I have met at least half a dozen guys in person who had skin bridges, and probably 3 or 4 times that number that I didn't meet, but like they sent me pictures. Because skin bridges are really ugly looking. It's where you get a little bit of skin from the shaft attaching to the head, and it's they call it a bridge because usually you can like stick your a probe, maybe not your finger, but like a toothpick or a Q-tip through it. And sometimes you'll get a guy and have like one, and sometimes you'll get a guy like half his head is covered in these things. It looks like their dick melted and like dripped onto their head. It's not pretty. And most of them, and I'll tell you, every single one of them that I met had no clue that that was from circumcision. They just had no idea. So if you did a survey of them, they would say circumcision's fine. It doesn't give them any problems. Now they are upset about their fucked up penis, but they don't know why it's fucked up because just no one ever told them. And also, so I've heard that they think the rates of that are something like 2 to 4%, something like that. Then you have like tight circumcisions that they don't actually remove the glands or cause you to lose your penis, but they cut off so much skin that any erection makes it super tight and it's actually uncomfortable, but guys get used to it. Their skin stretches a little, and they don't know that that's because of circumcision. So, it would be interesting to see someone try and sue along those lines. Like if we could get a lawsuit where someone says, hey, this is too tight. Like if they have a scar, and I've met guys who the circumcision scar halfway down their shaft, 2/3 of the way down their shaft. You can really tell the skin gets so tight, it gets like paper thin because, again, they don't know. This is again, one of the distinctions between neonate circumcision and adult circumcision. With an adult, you know how big the penis is and you know how much you can take off. And of course, you can also ask the guy, hey, how much do you want to take off? With an infant, you do not know. You cannot look at his, I don't know, almond-sized penis or peanut-sized penis and know, is this guy going to be, is he going to be 8 inches? Is he going to be 9 inches? Is he going to be 4 inches? You just don't know. And so when you start cutting the skin off, you just don't know what that's going to be when he grows up. And so I think there's some evidence that some doctors try and be as conservative as possible. So you do get some guys who have slightly lighter cuts, although that could just be light of the draw. But the standard cut with the Gomco clamp is a so-called tight American cut, and there's no skin mobility, which is huge. And it would be interesting to somebody sue along those lines. But as I said at the beginning of the video, currently the law is saying that doing something that's elective that's for cultural reasons is not okay. So you can't say we're circumcising our daughter because we're Muslims or it's our culture and our religion, but you can circumcise your son and cite those. But you have to cite medical reasons, and so they will. But then what's interesting is the medical reasons rely on cultural reasons. So if you listen to the AAP, when they say the benefits of circumcision outweigh the costs, and there's whole reasons for that because they didn't even estimate what the risks were, and they placed no value on the foreskin itself. So it's like you're cutting off a piece of the body and saying, well, as long as you don't get infected, there's no cost. I'm like, yeah, maybe you don't get infected, but you just lost that part of your body. So what's that worth? And when you ask cut guys, they say it's not worth anything because they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. But of course, if you ask guys who have that thing, they don't say that. They say, oh, I like it. It's nice. Don't cut it off. Um, but so you kind of have this double step where uh, doctors are saying it's justified or can be justified or should be allowed, but then they're citing religious and cultural reasons as the reason to do it or the main reason to do it or the reason why it should be allowed. Because the medical reasons, the medical benefits, they're kind of ethically really questionable and empirically very questionable as well. So the courts are throwing it out right now, and there are lawyers, it's Steven Svoboda, and there's another doctor. They interview him in the American Circumcision Story, and I know, like the lawyer I talked to yesterday, he's a big intactivist, right? So there are definitely intactivist lawyers out there, but they're like, currently, the law is going to accept the expert opinion of the medical staff, and the medical staff are mostly cut guys. Lots of them are Jewish. Lots of them are culpable because they've been doing it. Here's another problem: if you've been doing circumcisions, if you've done 4,000 or 5,000 circumcisions, you do not want to come out and say, you know what, circumcision is really not necessary. In fact, it's probably the wrong thing to do. Oh well, you just opened yourself up to like 4,000 lawsuits potentially. And in fact, I heard a story of a doctor in Maine who had circumcised like 1,200 kids in his town, that his sons were intact because he didn't think it was a good thing to do. And he did not advertise that his sons were intact because just imagine how the parents would feel. Well, you told us? Yeah. So, uh, yes, you should be able to sue. Yes, you should sue your parents, your doctors, the hospital, insurance companies, blah, blah, blah. But currently, no, because they're going to say as long as the doctors say it's okay, then it's okay. Even if the doctors are explicitly citing religious and cultural reasons. Uh, are you restoring again? I never stopped restoring. I'm about a C5. I've submitted video and pictures other places and asking, and some people said C4, but I think almost everyone said C5, but it depends on the day. My parents didn't circumcise me at birth because they didn't want to hurt their child. Unfortunately, when I was 16, because of my peers, I felt I was gross and I got circumcised. 31 now and restoring. Yeah, sorry to hear that. Very common story. Very, very common story. Most of the intact men that I know, if they grew up in the United States, they've had those feelings. Most of them did actually talk to their parents about it. One of the guy, he was Brazilian, but he grew up in the States, and he said, "Why didn't you get me cut? I don't fit in." And they were like, "Is there a problem? Like, do you feel pain? Does it hurt?" He said, "No, it feels fine." And they said, "Well, if it feels fine, let's just wait until you're older. And if you still feel this way in the future, then we can talk about it." And by the time he got older, he liked it and he fucking loved it, dude. Like, God, you could just touch it a little bit, and he's so now he understands that, but you don't necessarily understand that when you're a little kid. Oh, focus. There we go. Michael Rigati, did you now? You don't have to answer, but I'm curious. Uh, did your peers explicitly like make fun of you, or is this like locker room shower situation, or is it more like you were worried that they might, or you felt that they might? Because again, some of the guys I talked to, they never actually got bullied. They actually never got made fun of. They were just worried that they might. Could you get a better microphone? Maybe. I could look into that. It could be the settings too. I am just figuring this out. One of the reasons I'm doing live streams is just kind of work out the process. So, uh, yeah, I can look into that though. If anyone has any recommendations for good mics, go ahead and leave them down there, and I can look it up too. I think it's a setting. He probably doesn't need a new mic. Uh, let's see. I think I turned it down the other day because there was an echo happening. Let me go to editor, mic. Now, how about now? Is the volume heavier now? Too much? Too little? Okay, there you go. It was just I had the setting. There was an echo the other day, so I turned the setting down. There we go. Huh. But yeah, so I guess the point here is that the question to ask, people will frame it like, I'm cut, I feel fine. If I cut my child, he's also going to be cut and he's going to feel fine. Now, there's a chance that he won't, and actually the chance that he's going to realize that he's missing something are much higher now than they were in the past. And there's another thing, Brian Earp brings this up quite a bit. There's this idea of recourse. Let's say that you're uncircumcised. We leave it to you to make the choice. You grow up, you decide you would rather be circumcised. Well, it's pretty obvious what you can do. You have a pretty there's a remedy for that. You can get circumcised, and you can even tell the doctor, take a little, take a lot, take the frenulum, don't take the frenulum. Like you have options. And then the other thing is, you can, any pain or suffering that happens from that, you understand why it's happening, and you can cope with that in a much different way. When you're just inflicting that on a child, on a neonate, they have no idea. They don't know, oh, I'm Jewish and this is part of a 3,000 year, they just feel extreme pain and then they hate their mom forever. Hypothetically. So uh, there's that. But if you circumcise somebody and they grow up and they go, hey, I'd rather not be circumcised, fuck, dude, you're in a really bad spot. There's things you can do. You can restore, and I definitely encourage people to restore. And restoration is definitely an option, but it takes years. And even when it's done, you're not all the way there. You make progress, and in some cases, really dramatic progress, but it's not the same. And also, it just takes for fucking ever. It takes years and years and years. I was just Somebody on one of the Reddits created a restoration calculator, and it was something like, I forget, but it was coming out to like 4 to 5 months per centimeter, and I was like, that's ridiculously way faster than it is, I think. But I could be wrong. Maybe I'm just doing it wrong. Um, wow, way louder. Sorry, guys. Yeah, I turned the setting down because when I was sitting next to my safe, I was getting an echo. So the question is, what would they choose themselves? And we know once they get to the age of consent that they're probably going to choose to be intact. In fact, it's like 98% that they're going to choose to be intact. And the guys who say that they would choose anyway, they don't know what they're talking about. They've never felt it. I got in a big debate with Hypocrite. Not a big debate, but a comment debate with him on his video. He did a video with Stefan Molyneux. And it was interesting because he started talking about, oh, well, you know, girls don't like it because it's dirty. And he studied a study from Uganda where women are taught that foreskins equal AIDS, basically, and they don't have showers and whatever. But he was like, well, what if two guys they're construction workers and they work all day and they're super sweaty, and one of them's uncircumcised and one of them's circumcised, and they go to the bar, and then these two girls meet them and they go into the alley in the back of the bar to get blowjobs, and who's going to have a dirtier dick? And well, first of all, I know which one I would pick. But second of all, they're both dirty because they just worked all day. And but then I started describing meeting intact guys and how much pleasure they felt when you say stimulate their frenulum. So again, the frenulum is the little strip of skin connecting the foreskin to the glands, and you have two frenulums, one on your penis and one under your tongue. That structure there. And frenulums are usually the most sensitive or one of the most sensitive parts of the penis, and very light stimulation. Just doing that can make a guy orgasm sometimes. And even if he doesn't orgasm, he'll be squirming and moaning, and he'll love it. And I was describing that, and he goes, dude, can you just tone down how sexually explicit this is? I'm like, look, you just talked about getting your fucking dick sucked in an alleyway from a slut. And that's okay. So like, if you want to be sexually explicit to try and illustrate foreskin is dirty, that's okay. But then if you want to be sexually explicit to show like how good it feels, then that's gross. Don't talk about that, right? And the whole thing, and he was also referring to uncut guys as dirty clean, and he also referred to Brian Morrison as, quote, the man Brian Morrison, as if he's like some academic like juggernaut, and that's not true. He's a laughingstock. Like, he's a total weirdo. What a crazy story to try and justify circumcision. Yes, and I assume that Hypocrite, if he had not been circumcised, and he saw the same studies that he's seen now, with the same results, he would be like, yeah, this should not be done. I like my foreskin, it's awesome. He knows that it's not dirty, and he knows how good it is when a girl kisses it, or when he fucks a girl with it. And he's not going to be like, oh, I wish I could last longer. He's going to be like, holy shit, this is amazing. Fuck yeah, thank you, Mom. But there's no way to prove that. Like, I can't prove that, but if we just look statistically, guys who are intact stay intact. They don't want to change. But yeah, I think that the fiduciary responsibility of the parents or the guardian, whoever they are, pretty much preclude making a choice like this. I mean, you could just say in general that cosmetic surgeries are not within their purview. Medically necessary ones, absolutely. But even the biggest advocates of circumcision, even the Brian Morrisons, who will call it like a vaccination, that's not medical necessity. It's also ridiculous to compare it to vaccination, but even if you do, it's not medical necessity. So it's really straining credulity to go that far, and I think that it raises serious questions. Again, when I talked to my lawyer friend about this yesterday, he said, well, look, yes, in principle, that makes perfect sense, but the law is going to say if medical professionals say that it's a medical choice, then that's fine. But they're saying that it's a cultural and religious choice, and that's why it should be allowed. So, guys, I got to go here pretty soon. I got to go to Boston tonight, and so I have plans. But any other last minute questions, concerns, suggestions? Turn the mic up good. How's the camera quality? I think this looks fine. This is just the same camera I've had for like a decade, seems like. Oh, not a decade, maybe 8 years. I like doing it in the day. The sunlight's a lot better. Thanks, Ron. Always good to see you. You guys get, does it just show up in your feed or do you get like a fucking email when it comes up? How does that work? Boston's nice to visit. I wouldn't want to live there. I mean, I can't live there because of my guns, but it is nice to visit. Freedom Trail. Uh, what's the market? Quincy Market. Freedom. Yeah, it's a nice place to visit. Yeah, I mean, I go to a gun range that's right on the border, and people will be like, "Hey, when you drive back, make sure you don't take a right at that because you'll go into mass, and like half the shit you have is not legal there." So, when I drive north, as soon as I cross that border in New Hampshire, I unbuckle that seatbelt and I'm free. And it's a total. It is like they're both New England. 100% New England is New England, and there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of common history, but like there is a distinct cultural difference between New Hampshire and Mass, like distinct. And when I've talked to people here about like seatbelt laws, this is the only state that doesn't require you to wear a seatbelt. People in New Hampshire are like, why the fuck would you require people to wear a seatbelt? It's your life. Who gives a shit? 5 napkin burger there. Do you have a favorite place you like to visit in the U.S.? So I have a soft spot for Gillette, Wyoming. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, but I spent a lot of time working there and a lot of good people there. And it's kind of this neat community that's on the prairie but close to the mountains. The weather's real nice. It's really extreme. I like the culture, and it's kind of like I don't want to say it's a hidden gem because it's not really a gem, but it's just a nice area. Sheridan's also very nice. Um, Other than that, I don't know. I would like to travel more in the U.S. though. It's hard for me to say for sure, but that area is yeah. You should make a video about the distinction between New Hampshire and Mass. Oh, maybe I will someday. I mean, I've made videos about the Free State Project, which kind of is illustrates a lot of those anyway. But like the guns is a huge one. Like we're getting to the point where there's no gun laws in New Hampshire anymore. Open carry, concealed carry, constitutional carry, no permit. It's just a different culture. They never close the roads. So if we get a really bad blizzard, New Hampshire will never close the roads. They will tell you that we won't rescue you, but so don't call 911. But they won't close the roads, and Mass will. They also, if you call them, if you're hiking and you get lost and you need them to come rescue you, they will give you a bill, which is pretty cool. So it's the only state that their search and rescue doesn't lose money. It actually makes money. It's literally the only state that's the case. California loses like $100 million a year doing that, and New Hampshire they're kind of like, hey, if you put yourself in danger and we got to save you, that's fine, we'll do it, but that ain't free. That's taxpayer money that you don't just get because you're a fool, which that's a good attitude to have. So, have you tried O-rings? Supposedly you can recreate the function of a front or band with them. I have tried O-rings and I don't like them. I found them very uncomfortable, and I think that they are dangerous if you wear them at night. I would absolutely not want to get an erection with them on. And they chafed my skin way too much. So yes, it's true that they hold your skin over your head. I recommend much better use a product called the faux skin or FAUX SKIN, artificial foreskin from a company called Oxballs. I'm not obviously not going to whip it out here, but I'm wearing it at this moment actually. That is a great retaining device, and you can envelop your head with your skin, and it's once you get it on, and it's pretty easy to get on, you can jerk off in it, you can urinate in it, you can wear it to the gym, you can do whatever you want, you can sleep in it. It's you don't want to wear it days and days and days and days because it will chafe your skin, but you can wear it for hours and hours and hours and have no problem. So I would recommend, yeah, it's a website called Oxballs. I think it's in the UK. They sell a lot of products like dildos and stuff like that, but find their artificial foreskins. I think they have 2 sizes, and Yeah, I like those way better. O-rings, I've tried them and it was also difficult with the O-rings. Is the sizing was so picky. The very net one O-ring size bigger, way too loose. One O-ring size too small, way too tight. Just no give at all, and uncomfortable. So I don't like them. But hey, that's just me. There are people who use them. There are people who restore them. So if you can find a way to make it work, knock yourself out. But I've tried, and I don't like them. I prefer the Moreskin. So, all right, guys, I have got to get ready to go. But it's been nice chatting with everybody, and I hope you guys have a good weekend. I'll do the best to have a good one as well. So, good night.